You're listening to Engage, the podcast for Delta pilots. On today's episode, as part of the Engage Safety Series, How It Works with Jeremy Maclellan from the Central Air Safety Committee. Here's your host, Ryan Argenta.
Welcome back to the Engage podcast. This is the Safety Series with Jeremy Maclellan of the Central Air Safety Committee. Today we're talking LATT, Latest Allowable Takeoff Time, calculations for flight duty period, flight time limits. It's apparently a commonly misunderstood topic or misapplied topic. Jeremy, kick it off. What are we messing up and how can we do this better?
Absolutely. So as everybody knows, we're required to certify we're legal to operate Delta aircraft every time we push back and head off from point A to point B. There's no shortage of regulations we have to comply with. And one of them is to remain within our FAR 117 flight duty period and flight time limits for the day, as well as cumulative limits for a week or a month or a year. What we're talking about today, as you said, is the latest allowable takeoff time, of which there are two that we need to ensure that we are operating within each time we go fly. And that's the flight duty period, LATT, and the flight time, or better known as the Block LATT. The company does provide this information on our paperwork. So the FDP LATT is going to be near the bottom of the original paperwork that you get. And of course, this is assuming you're still holding on to the old paper flight plan printed out at the gate. We will speak to a little bit about Mission Plus and the electronic flight plan and some of the other things there. The flight time or Block LATT calculation paperwork comes with your final paperwork. So it's not originally included in that. And a lot of times that information is accurate, although we do see plenty of examples where that information on the paperwork is not accurate due to a multitude of things that can happen to each pilot throughout the day and throughout your FDP. So we're going to talk about some of the what ifs or some of the pitfalls of LATT calculations, as well as a sort of 30,000 foot overview as to the type of information that you need to properly calculate your own LATT.
So for perspective, and here's what I think a lot of us do, and this just happened to me last week actually, but we had a gate turned back for a maintenance issue. Maintenance says it's going to be a couple hours. And so you immediately go to the paperwork. I look at that time, it said 03Z, and we say, oh great, we have 3 hours from now. And we never thought about it again. That was the end of it. We pushed back, took off, no problem. But it seems that's not entirely accurate, right?
Yeah. And so it's important to remember, I would say one of the most commonly missed aspects of LATT is that pilots get focused on one LATT and they don't consider both. Oftentimes, the LATT that most pilots run up against is the FDP LATT. You have an extended day, you have rolling delays, you've already reported. And so you had a 12-hour day, and that 12 hours is clicking away. Every minute that goes by, you're 1 minute closer to your maximum flight duty period limit for the day. Block or flight time LATT does not act that same way. That clock's only running once you've blocked out until you block in. So if you're sitting at the gate for a 2-hour delay with the door open, the FDP LATT is clicking away, but the Block LATT is not. Oftentimes what we see is that Block LATT is the LATT that pilots are not considering. And they'll get a message on ACARS that looks and smells very much like an FDP LATT message. Hey, you're coming up on your FDP LATT. And they say, oh, it's fine. We feel good. We can extend. We'll deal with it airborne. And they didn't read the message close enough. And it was a Block LATT message, which you cannot extend. And now they took off illegally. So that's one example of how sometimes we're only considering one of the LATTs and not both, especially as the operational pressure is piling up and we don't take the time to stop and make sure we consider both of those. We see that reported quite often in ASAP.
But the LATT that's published in the paperwork is only the FDP LATT.
On the initial paperwork, that is correct. That is only the FDP LATT.
And so can you help me better understand the Block LATT? And if I'm scheduled for a 5-hour flight, transcon, how could I be up against the Block LATT in this kind of scenario?
Absolutely. So when we look at our flight time or Block LATT, I'm going to talk unaugmented first, and then I will talk augmented. But for unaugmented, it depends on what time you reported that day acclimated for your home base. So let's say you showed this morning at 6 a.m. and you're starting your trip, a 6 a.m. report time, you would be good for 9 hours of block for that day. That number comes back to 8 if you report before 5 a.m. body clock, or if you report after 8 p.m. These are all in FAR 117 Table A, which is the unaugmented maximum flight time limits table. So if we stay with that scenario, your 5-hour transcon, you should never have to worry. If that's the only leg you're doing that day, you won't have to worry about block LATT that day, unless you went into holding for 3.5 hours. What I will tell you is that, let's say you're doing Boston to Seattle. That tends to be a 6.5-hour block flight. No problem with block LATT, right? Until you land in Seattle and you don't have a gate. And you're sitting out for hours waiting for a gate. That's a lot of times we see people that are up against a flight time limit for the day. They take off before their LATT, but then they land and don't have a gate and they end up going over the 8 or 9 hours. That's where sometimes that happens. And by the way, there's nothing the crew could do there. They're not illegal. They do report it often in ASAP. But if we're going back to the LATT piece of it, that's obviously before you take off. So your 5-hour transcon, you really shouldn't have to worry about that LATT. Where it would get you, similar to what you saw last week, is that same scenario. You push back from Boston, you take off, you have a problem on departure, and you do an air return after you hold for a while to dump gas and come back and land. You just burned, let's say, 1.5 hours of block. You have to account for that. Once you get a new airplane and go do that 6-hour block flight back to Seattle, you have to make sure you consider that 1.5 hours of block time that you did burn with that air return.
And potentially you could run into this on a multi-leg day, right? Where maybe you have 3 legs that are 2 or 3 hours long and you're legal there up to, your domestic block limit. Now you have an issue. So that's where you could run into problems.
That's correct.
That seems pretty keen for you to look at if you have a multi-leg day.
And if I were able to give pilots some indicators of when the hair on the back of your neck should start raising when we're talking about block LATT. If you already knew you had a high block day to begin with, that's strike one, right? You were scheduled for 8+ hours of block. When you get to that last flight, you should really be looking at that block LATT very closely. If you had to hold for a while, anything to increase your scheduled block for the day that maybe you were originally thinking was going to happen, if you had to sit waiting for a gate for a long time, if you pushed back and did a gate return, if you did an air return, all of these things that are adding block time that you may not be thinking about, that should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Take that extra bit of time before you close the door and start the block LATT or start the block time clicking. Take the time to do the math and make sure you've considered anything that could have added block to your day that you did not originally consider.
Okay. Makes sense. Jeremy, what about deadheads? Is there a LATT for deadheads? Or if you're coming off an operating leg to a deadhead, how do you calculate your LATT for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is oftentimes confused by pilots, and for good reason. The rules are slightly different when you're looking at FAR 117 and how deadheads affect those limits versus the PWA limits, which look very similar. So I want to foot stomp that everything I'm about to say is purely FAR 117 legalities. The contract is different. So for FAR 117 and legalities, if you fly and your day ends with a deadhead, that deadhead is not part of your FDP. So as an example, you fly 2 legs and your third and final leg of the day is a deadhead. Your FDP ended after the second flight, the last operating leg. So your FDP ended then, therefore FDP LATT is no longer an issue, nor is block, because you're not operating that last flight. This is when you would then get into the contractual provisions of how long your duty day to include a deadhead will be. Another example is if you fly, then deadhead, then fly, all of that counts toward the FDP. So a deadhead on the front end or in the middle, as long as you operate a flight after that, all counts toward your FDP and therefore can affect your FDP LATT.
Okay, so foot stop there, right? If you have some issues with a deadhead or delayed deadhead at the beginning or the middle of a rotation or the middle of your FDP, that should raise some hairs. Start looking at your FDP LATT.
Absolutely. Yes. That all counts toward your FDP for the day, unless the deadhead is at the end, at which
Okay,
point your FDP has stopped prior to that.
makes sense. Okay, and then we talked about crew mix. A captain from Minneapolis, an FO from Seattle who's been on reserve or perhaps a reroute. So if you're on short call in Minneapolis and you're called out to join an existing flight, how does that reserve availability period, that RAP, affect your LAT, and how do you calculate that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will start with the theoretical piece of how short call and wrap works for those that may not completely understand it. So there are two pieces that go into your overall duty day when you're a reserve pilot on short call. One piece is the reserve availability period, or the RAP. That is the time period from when you start short call until you report for a rotation that you have been assigned. Once you've been assigned a rotation and you report for that rotation, that report time is what you go into table B or C to find out how long your FDP is for that day. So for an example, let's say you went on to short call at 4 a.m. and you were assigned a rotation at some point while you're on short call that reports at 7 a.m. You will go into, for unaugmented, table B, and you will see that you had 2 operating segments today and you reported at 7 a.m. So your FDP is 14 hours. But the story doesn't stop there. You have to account for that reserve availability period also for your total day. So you had a 3-hour reserve availability period from 4 a.m. to 7 a.m. And then you have a 14-hour FDP after that. If you add those two together, you come up with 17 hours. For unaugmented crews, FAR 117 limits your max day RAP plus FDP together to 16 hours. So the math you do is your FDP for the day plus 4 hours up to a maximum of 16 hours. So that's how a reserve pilot who is on short call can have a different LAT, specifically for this scenario, an FDP LAT, than potentially the other crew member they're flying with. I will end with a foot stomp that if you're on short call and you get called out for a rotation, your FDP is not extendable. You cannot add the 2-hour FDP extension to that day if you were assigned a rotation from short call.
That's a great point, Jeremy. Thank you.
And for the augmented piece of this, it is slightly different. The only really big difference is table C and a augmented pilot does not have the 16-hour maximum restriction. So for augmented crews, from the start of short call to the end of the FDP, cannot exceed table C plus 4 hours, but it does not have that end cap of 16 hours on it.
Gotcha. Very good. What else do we need to know about LAT? What are our resources here?
So first of all, you do have the paperwork provided by the company. Mission Plus is a new tool that we're all getting used to right now and will become the standard going forward. It helps you automate some of the math with the FDP and Block LATT on it, but like anything, it can be garbage in, garbage out. So it's important to understand all of the math that goes into the LAT calculation. One of the best resources for that is in the Scheduling Reference Handbook, which is under the ALPA folder in Aerodocs under Scheduling. The Scheduling Reference Handbook has a section, an entire chapter on how to calculate FDP and Block LATT and all of the data that you need to collect in order to do that math properly. I would point the pilots there first. I would be careful using what I'll call third-party or commercial off-the-shelf calculators and apps that exist out there. ALPA does have one, and they're continuously working on that to make it more user-friendly. But at the end of the day, nothing replaces good old fashioned doing the math yourself. One technique I offer to anybody I fly with, typically when you have to do these LATT calculations, you're in the heat of the battle and the clock's ticking and you're coming up against a limit that you need to hurry up and go. That's a bad time to start practicing doing the LATT calculation. So I offer the pilots I fly with on a normal, no pressure flight. We've already done all the briefings that we're going to do, and we've got 15 minutes to kill. Pull the paperwork out and see if your math matches the math on the company provided paperwork. Practice gathering the data and practice putting all the pieces together and see if you can come up with the same time that the company paperwork provided you. If it didn't, try to figure out where the discrepancy is. Another common issue is not all pilots have the same LATT for a given flight. So, the first officer that I'm flying with today could have been called out to fly this flight from short call. They're going to have a different FDP LATT than I have for when I started. Oftentimes we have split pairings where, the FO is Seattle based and the captain is Minneapolis based. They're going to have two different acclimation times. Therefore, table A and table B could be different. So never assume that both pilots or all the pilots on an augmented crew have the same LATT.
That's a great point. So things to keep tabs on, and it's really each individual pilot, because especially domestic ops, we're rarely a hard crew for an entire 3-day, 4-day trip.
Exactly. A couple of common pitfalls that we see with LATT calculations. There's a previous podcast about shifted report times. So you had a 7 a.m. report time this morning, and before you reported, it got shifted to 9 a.m. That could affect your FDP limit for the day. Therefore, it could affect your LATT calculation for FDP for the day. We already spoke about gate returns and air returns. Those will have an effect on your flight time or block LATT because you're adding block to your day that you maybe did not consider. Other things that we see, if you pick up an out of base green slip or an out of base white slip, it is assumed when you pick that up that you are acclimated to the time zone of the base you picked the trip up in. So if you're New York based and you pick up a Seattle out of base green slip, we're not talking about acclimated to New York for the purposes of table A and B. We're talking about you're acclimated to Seattle. The last thing that we already hit on, but I do want to foot stop again, is it's crucial for each pilot to do their own LATT calculations because you may have different LATT times. Another common practice is to have another pilot back you up. If you're thinking you're going to be close to a LATT time, you do the math. If you have time and ability, have another pilot back you up and do that math. That way, you have a much higher chance of success if you have a couple different sets of eyes looking at it.
Very good. Latest allowable takeoff times, way more complex than I thought. Thanks for bringing that to our attention and walking us through that. Tons of resources out there. And really, bottom line, this is FAR 117. This is your license on the line. Be safe. Slow down, take the parking brake, think about it. Do the mental gymnastics. You have the back, the support. You've got the duty pilot crew tracking. Make sure we get it right and keep the rubber on the road out there, So Jeremy Maclellan, Central Air Safety, thanks so much for these. We're going to continue to do these safety shorts. You can look forward to more of these in the coming weeks. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
This has been Engaged, the podcast from Delta Pilots. Thanks for listening. My name is Ryan Argenta. Stay safe and keep the rubber on the road.
You're listening to Engage, the podcast for Delta Pilots. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform, and receive notifications when a new episode is available.